Maple Street looked like any other quiet suburban road. Neatly trimmed hedges, white fences, mailboxes standing like obedient soldiers in front of identical houses. But the house at the very end of the street was different. It didn't belong. It leaned slightly to one side, its roof sagging like a tired spine, its windows dark even during the brightest hours of the day. People who lived on Maple Street avoided looking at it for too long. Not because anything obvious was wrong, but because something about it felt wrong. The house belonged to Evan Mercer. Evan had lived there for almost all his life. He moved in with his mother as a child and never left, even after she died 2 years ago. Now, at 39, he lived alone in the large, silent house, going to work, coming home, and disappearing behind those walls every evening. He was polite, quiet, forgettable, and that made him dangerous. Every morning, Evan left his house at exactly 7:10 a.m. He wore the same gray jacket, the same worn brown shoes, and carried the same black backpack. He nodded to neighbors, but never spoke unless spoken to. Most people thought he was just another lonely man who never recovered from losing his mother. But what they didn't see was what happened after the front door closed behind him. Down the narrow staircase at the back of the house was a door painted the same dull white as the walls. It didn't look special. It didn't look threatening. But it was always locked. Behind that door was the real heart of Evan's house, the place that never slept. Across the street, Mrs. Dorothy Holloway noticed everything. She was 72, widowed, and spent most of her time sitting near her living room window with a cup of tea. People thought she was just a bored old woman, but Mrs. Holloway had lived on Maple Street for over 40 years. She had seen families grow, fight, and fall apart. She had seen secrets ruin lives, and she knew when something wasn't right. She had been watching Evan for months. It started with small things. Evan would come home with grocery bags far heavier than one person needed, sometimes twice a day. He would carry them straight past the kitchen and down toward the basement door. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the street was quiet and the wind barely moved the trees, Mrs. Holloway heard muffled thuds coming from Evan's house, soft, almost rhythmic, sometimes a faint cry, other times a dull banging that stopped as suddenly as it started. She told herself it was the pipes, until one night she heard a voice. It was weak, frightened. "Please." The sound was so faint she almost thought she imagined it, but she hadn't. Then there was Lena Walsh. Lena was everything Evan wasn't, bright, confident, and alive. She worked part-time at a small diner 2 blocks away and walked home every night just after sunset. Maple Street was on her route. She had passed Evan's house dozens of times without ever noticing it. On the night she disappeared, Lena left work at 7:45 p.m. The sky was already dark, and a cold wind cut through her jacket as she walked. She texted her friend, complaining about how tired she was. That was the last message she ever sent. A later neighbor remembered seeing her near Maple Street arguing with someone, but by the time police asked, the details were already fading. 3 days later, her phone was found in a ditch. Her family was hysterical. The town was terrified. Police cars rolled into Maple Street, lights flashing against the quiet houses. Officers knocked on doors asking the same questions. Did you see Lena Walsh? Did you hear anything unusual? Did anyone suspicious pass through this area? When they reached Evan Mercer's house, he opened the door slowly, as if he had been expecting them. "Yes, officer?" he said calmly. "We're looking for a missing girl, Lena Walsh. Have you seen her?" Evan shook his head. "No, I mostly keep to myself." Mind if we come in? Of course not. Inside, the house was spotless, too spotless. The air smelled faintly of bleach, strong enough to sting the nose. The furniture was old but clean, not a single photo hung on the walls. They searched the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. Nothing. Then one officer noticed a narrow door at the back of the house. "What's down there?" Evan hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to be noticed. "My basement. Storage." "We'll take a look." Evan reached into his pocket, then stopped. "I'm afraid I can't find the key." The officer tried the handle. Locked. "Well, if you locate it, give us a call. We might need to check it." "Of course," Evan replied, his smile thin. The officers left. Evan stood alone in the hallway, staring at the basement door. From behind it, something moved. A soft scraping sound echoed through the wood. Evan leaned closer and whispered, "Be quiet." The sound stopped. Outside, Mrs. Holloway watched the house, a chill running down her spine. Some doors weren't meant to stay closed forever, and somewhere in the dark beneath Evan Mercer's home, someone was still alive, waiting for that door to open.
The street was quieter than it had ever been. After Lena Walsh vanished, Maple Street no longer felt safe. Curtains stayed closed, porch lights burned all night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Fear had settled into the neighborhood like a fog that refused to lift. But fear didn't stop Mrs. Dorothy Holloway from watching. From her window, she saw Evan Mercer come and go with the same mechanical routine. He still left at 7:10 a.m. He still came back just before sunset. But something had changed. He was nervous. He glanced over his shoulder when he stepped outside. His eyes scanned the street before he unlocked his door. He walked faster now, his shoulders stiff, as if the walls themselves were listening. And then there were the lights. Almost every night, a faint yellow glow appeared behind the small basement window at the back of his house. It flickered, went dark, then returned. Sometimes it stayed on until morning. One night, Mrs. Holloway heard it again. The sound. Not pipes, not the wind. A soft knocking. Tap, tap, tap. Her teacup rattled slightly in her hand. It was coming from Evan's basement. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but stopped. They had already searched the house. They had already walked away. If she wanted the truth, she would have to get it herself. The next morning, Maple Street was quiet when Evan left for work. Mrs. Holloway waited until his footsteps faded. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She stepped outside. The cold air hit her face as she crossed the street slowly, pretending she was just going for a walk. Her eyes stayed fixed on the sidewalk in front of Evan's house. That was when she saw it. Something small, half hidden near the curb. A key. She bent down and picked it up. It was old, brass, and attached to a tiny faded tag. The writing was barely visible, but she could still make it out. Basement. Her heart began to pound. The key was warm, as if someone had dropped it only moments before. Mrs. Holloway stood frozen for several seconds. She knew she should call the police. She knew she should go back inside, but she didn't. Instead, she walked up Evan Mercer's front steps. The door was unlocked. The house smelled even stronger of bleach than before. It burned her nose and made her eyes water. The silence inside felt heavy, pressing against her ears. "Evan?" she called. No answer. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Every step toward the back of the house felt harder than the last. Her legs trembled, her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The basement door stood exactly where it always had, plain, white, locked. Mrs. Holloway slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a quiet click, the door unlocked. A cold draft rushed up the stairs, carrying a smell that made her stomach twist. Metal, dampness, and something rotten underneath. Then she heard it. A weak, broken voice. "Help, please!" Tears filled her eyes as she stepped down into the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, a single light bulb flickered. Its glow revealed something that made her scream. A girl lay on a dirty mattress, her wrists bound with rope. Her face was bruised, her lips were cracked and bleeding. But she was alive. "Lena?" Mrs. Holloway whispered. The girl nodded weakly. Before she could move, a hand clamped over her mouth. "You shouldn't have come down here," Evan's voice whispered behind her. He dragged Mrs. Holloway away from Lena and slammed the basement door shut. "You found the key," he said quietly. "I tried so hard to not lose it." Mrs. Holloway struggled, but Evan was stronger than he looked. "She was just a girl," she cried. She was lonely, just like the others. Mrs. Holloway's blood ran cold. The others? How many? She asked. Evan smiled. Too many. Above them, sirens suddenly wailed in the distance. Evan froze. Mrs. Holloway had dropped her phone when she entered the house, still connected to the emergency call she had made before coming in. Footsteps began to pound upstairs. The hunt was over, but Evan wasn't finished yet. The basement felt like it was shrinking. Evan Mercer stood between Mrs. Holloway and the stairs, his eyes wild, his chest rising and falling in fast, uneven breaths. The distant wail of sirens grew louder by the second, echoing through the walls like a countdown to the end. "You think they'll save you?" Evan said, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "They never save anyone. They always come too late." Mrs. Holloway slowly raised her hands, trying to keep him calm. "Evan, please, let the girl go. You don't have to do this." Lena lay on the mattress behind them, too weak to move, her eyes wide with terror. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the man who had turned her life into a nightmare. Evan turned to her. "I gave you everything," he said softly. "Food, shelter. I kept you safe." "You chained me to a wall," Lena whispered. Evan's expression hardened. "You were going to leave," he snapped. "They always do." The sirens were close now. Doors slammed outside. Shouting voices filled the street. Evan panicked. "This isn't how it ends," he muttered. "It's not." He lunged toward Lena, reaching for her bindings. Mrs. Holloway saw her chance. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe leaning against the wall and swung it with all the strength her aging arms could manage. The pipe struck Evan in the side of the head. He fell to the floor with a sickening thud. Lena screamed. Mrs. Holloway rushed to her. Her fingers shook as she untied her ropes, cutting into her own skin in her panic. "You're safe. You're safe now." Footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Police, don't move!" Officers flooded the basement, guns raised. They took one look at the scene and rushed forward. Evan tried to stand, but two officers pinned him to the floor and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. He didn't fight. He laughed, a high, broken sound that sent chills through everyone in the room. "They think it's over," he said, staring at Lena.
but houses remember. As he was dragged past her, he leaned close enough for only she could hear. "You'll never really leave that room." Lena collapsed into tears as paramedics wrapped her in a blanket and lifted her onto a stretcher. The basement was sealed that night. The horrors inside it were photographed, documented, and taken away. Chains, mattresses, photographs of girls who never came home. Some of them were smiling. Outside, Maple Street was filled with flashing lights and stunned faces. Mrs. Holloway sat on the back of an ambulance, a blanket over her shoulders, staring at Evan Mercer as he was shoved into a police car. "You did the right thing," an officer told her gently. She nodded, but she didn't feel brave. She felt haunted. Lena was rushed to the hospital, her parents waiting in tears as she was wheeled inside. She tried to speak, to tell them what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Some things were too dark to be said out loud. Evan's trial became the biggest story the town had ever seen. Journalists dug through his past, trying to understand how a quiet, lonely man could become a monster. They never found all the bodies. Some of the victims had simply vanished. And that was the worst part, because it meant there were still families out there waiting for daughters who would never come home. Evan never confessed. He just smiled. Even after he was locked away, Maple Street didn't feel normal again. The house stood empty, its windows dark. But sometimes a light flickered in the basement. And sometimes, very late at night, Mrs. Holloway swore she could hear knocking. Maple Street never truly recovered. In the weeks after Evan Mercer was arrested, reporters filled the quiet neighborhood. News vans lined the curb. Cameras pointed at the house at the end of the street, the one everyone had passed for years without really seeing. They called it a house of horrors, but the people who lived there knew a darker truth. It was a house that had been screaming for help long before anyone listened. Evan's trial was fast and brutal. Evidence from the basement was impossible to deny. Chains, photographs, DNA samples, and the testimony of Lena Walsh painted a picture so disturbing that several jurors had to leave the courtroom during the proceedings. Evan never showed remorse. He sat behind the defense table with his hands folded, staring straight ahead, occasionally smiling for no reason at all. When asked why he had done it, he answered calmly, "They always left. I just made sure they stayed." The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. As he was led away, Evan turned back once, his eyes locking with Lena's. "You're still mine," he whispered. Those words would follow her for the rest of her life. Lena tried to return to normal. She went back to school. She tried to laugh with her friends. She tried to sleep in her own bed again. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the basement, the chains, the walls, the door. Her parents eventually moved her to another town, far from Maple Street, far from the house that had almost stolen her life. Still, no matter where she went, she carried the memory with her. Some doors never fully close. Mrs. Holloway stayed on Maple Street. People called her a hero. They thanked her. They brought her flowers and cards. But none of that erased what she had seen. Every night she kept her curtains open, watching the empty house at the end of the street, watching the basement window, waiting. Months passed. The house was cleaned, repaired, and sold. A young couple moved in, unaware of what had happened there. The paint was fresh, the doors were replaced, but the basement door was still the same, locked. One night, long after the new owners had gone to sleep, a faint light appeared in the basement window. Mrs. Holloway noticed it immediately. Her heart began to pound. The house was supposed to be empty. She called the police. By the time they arrived, the light was gone. Nothing was found. But the next night, it happened again and again. The new owners swore they weren't going into the basement. They said the door wouldn't even open. But someone was down there, or something. Years later, Evan Mercer died in prison. A heart attack. The news barely made the papers. But on the night he died, every light in the house on Maple Street turned on. At once, including the basement. Mrs. Holloway watched in horror as the basement door slowly opened by itself. From deep inside the darkness, a familiar sound drifted up the stairs. A soft, desperate knocking. Tap, tap, tap. The house had never let go, and it never would.